Good morning, Dr. Thompson.
Good morning, Mr. Lassiter. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. How about yourself?
Doing all right, thanks. Trying to keep relatively cool here. Central Italy as well.
Yeah, warm there, huh?
In the high of this 20-year cycle, again, about every 20 years, it's so going on the record here, so the data can't be deleted again like it is from 20 years ago. But every 20 years we hit near the 40s, and we spend a good amount of time there in July and August.
My goodness. Yeah, kind of sweltering.
It is. It's fairly. Yeah, I mean, so that means to put it in Fahrenheit terms, that's the 110s, 120, the teens, 100 and teens, something. Yeah, the sun is just
like a balmy day.
It's hot. Yeah.
Gee whiz. Well, here we are, and we're finally able to tackle these last 3 chapters. We'll do chapter 17 today, and the next week and the week after that, we can be done with the novel complete and in the can. It'd be kind of cool.
Yeah.
I just got back from a whirlwind tour of the Rockies, so there for a week. I got what mountains look like. Now, of course, you're there in Italy. Have you been able to visit at all the Alps, to see the Alps at all?
Not yet, but I hope to in the relatively near future get up there, especially on these hottest of days in mid-August when we get away for a little bit. We'll maybe take a little bit of a road trip, the European road trip I never took after high school. So we'll see if we can do a little bit of that with kids and the whole family. It should be the same experience, right?
I suppose.
But hopefully we'll be getting up there. I do get to see the Apennines running down the spine of Italy every so actually from Orvieto on a very clear day. That is to say, not really this time of year. It's a bit hazy, but on a very clear days in the spring and the fall, we can see across and actually see some of the snow-capped peaks of the Apennines out there. Some of the highest mounts from here. It's a good 3-hour drive to there, but every week I'm out in the foothills of the Apennines in a monastery to do some teaching out there.
Nice.
So that's lovely to be able to get into some real elevation.
And have you been to the Alps before in your life? I mean, have you visited there before?
I don't believe that I've actually been there. No, I haven't. I've been within sight of them, so north of Milan. And I've seen the Alps, but I've not been.
But you've been to the Apennines, okay? I'm just kind of. Our Midwestern viewers may have very little clue as to what a mountain actually looks like.
Yeah.
I know growing up in Indiana, mountains for us were like a divot in the ground for skiing.
Anything that rises.
Yeah, right, exactly. Feet, it's like, it's a mountain. But when you actually get into an actual range of mountains, even the mountains there on the East Coast, the relatively small Smoky Mountains, that's pretty big stuff. But the really big mountains like the Apennines and the Pyrenees, for instance, or the mountains out there in the Rockies, that you get the sense, or at least I get the sense that they're going to fall down on you. They're so huge. You look and they keep going up and up and up and up and up. And I think that it's good to see them. And then for me, it's good to see them and come back to the Midwest. Because it gives me an idea of what Tolkien is talking about when he talks about the crossing of the Misty Mountains, and the crossing there of Gandalf and the Fellowship there in the Fellowship of the Ring story. They're huge. They're really massive pieces of rock.
It was. And if you haven't seen the really big ranges like that, like the Rockies, like the Pyrenees, like the Alps, and the Himalayas, all the more so. Even here in the Apennines in Italy, it's really no comparison. You don't, we just don't have a sense of that scale as you've been there. I know one of my friends from the Alps, or who lives just, you know, just into Italy from the Alps proper, who now lives in central Italy. He scoffs, you know, and they talk around, you know, oh, they go over in the mountains there where you're living now. He's like, oh, these are mountains. I mean, the locals call them mountains, but this is, but you know, those are things that are, you know, 1,000, 2,000 meters in height. You know, he lives at 1,000 meters, and it goes up from that. And he's like, these aren't the mountains I grew up with, you know, that kind of thing. It's a very different sense of scale. Huge things that are truly massive. It's a wonder to behold.
Yeah, it dwarfs a person when you actually see them. But to be honest, when we were traveling across the Dakotas, I got a sense of that being dwarfed by nature just in that vast openness of the Dakotas and Montana.
Yeah.
You know, you get a similar thing there where you're crossing a land that's so huge that you look and there's not a tree, there's not a rock, there's not a shrub, and just that scale of land is it's phenomenal. So I suppose you could apply that to something like the in the Lord of the Rings, if you're looking at the geography that he created, that crossing of the burning plains of Gorgoroth or something, you know, just this vast openness, and the Eye of Sauron probing you. I don't know if the Eye of Sauron probes you that much in Montana.
That's right, North Dakota. You've been compared to the wasted plains of Gorgoroth.
There are parts, I mean, I tell you, crossing over the Dakotas, we had rented a big van, a 15-passenger van with one of these big open windshields. So you feel kind of like you're flying a low-flying airplane or something, you know. But we're passing through the Dakotas, and it's this incredible land everywhere, and the sun was intense. But you also had a lot of dry land, 'cause they've had a lot of drought, and then you had locusts everywhere. And these swarms of locusts, as we're driving down the road, doing about 70 miles an hour, they'd start hitting the van like machine guns, you know, pum, 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 pum. And then one would hit the roof, you'd hear it go boom over the roof. It was like you're getting shot at out there, you know, as you're crossing the land. And of course, they'd all end up on the front of the car. So when we got into the rental place, the guy looked at their cars. But, you know, that's his job. He gets to clean all that. They told me to put your car wash.
Right.
You know.
What a manual job.
Gets paid the big bucks. So anyways, that vast sense of land is quite spectacular. And I can see Tolkien, who was a bit traveled. I mean, he'd grown up in South Africa, and he had fought there in France and traveled about a bit. But he was creating a world that had those same kind of huge elements to them.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, it gave me a bit of perspective. I also had a neat thing too when I was going out there to the Dakotas, because it's a long drive. I mean, the sense of scale, we're talking 1,000-mile drive. And it was long. And it was diminished greatly, partly because I was looking at the land, the formation of the land. But it was also diminished because we were listening to Rob Inglis reading the Fellowship of the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, sure. I
had purchased the last one, The Return of the King, and so we listened to that whole novel on the way out there. And right as we got up to the mountains, is when Frodo had the ring bitten off his finger, and Gollum falls into Eradrin. Not to give away the ending for those who haven't read it, but it's like that was this amazing experience. We were all enwrapped in the story as we're crossing over, and there was a point there where I think it must have been when the Nazgul king gets stabbed by Merry, I think, and then Eowyn kills him. And my 11-year-old boy is in the back. He shouts like, "Yeah!" So it's like this war cry from the back of the car. That's great. So it was quite an experience. I think, too, listening to it this time around, because it's been a while since I've read the novel, I was seeing a lot of parallels between this one and Hobbit, between what he does in The Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, which is kind of intriguing. I mean, just this chapter alone that we're going to be tackling, The Clouds Burst, chapter 17, there are parallels here that happened there in the Battle of Gladden Fields, I think it is, and the Siege of Minas Tirith. The death of Theoden, that's very similar to what happens to Thorin.
Comes charging out. He gets slain. Yeah, that's true. Equal solemnity and mourning associated with.
And of course, the eagles. The saving of power eagles that come in. That's a parallel that occurs too. I found that there was being hit on the head. A similar thing happens to Bilbo in this chapter, where he gets hit on the head and then he passes out and you know more. The last thing he hears is the eagles are coming. Same thing happens to
Yeah.
I think Merry. Yeah, I think it's Merry on the battlefield, that he basically gets buried
Pippin.
in orc.
Pippin before the gates of big orc
Yeah,
falls or
yeah,
troll.
right, exactly. He's out,
Yeah.
and they don't know whether he's alive or dead. So, and you also have the overwhelming numbers. I mean, this is something which happens frequently. I mean, it happens even in the Silmarillion. The forces of evil are like a tidal wave. You know, it's just almost overwhelming.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with that? How do you fight that? You know, in the sense that it's all over. You know, Denethor saying we're all done for. A very similar sense to what happens here in this chapter, where the orc numbers that overwhelm are they're easily 5-10 times more than what the combined forces are that we have in the chapter. So just themes, themes that seem to connect between the two books. I wonder sometimes. I don't think Tolkien's recycling material, but I think that he's taking ideas and he's fleshing them out more in his Lord of the Rings series. So, kind of interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine sort of the psychological, emotional experience of a battle like that, and not saying replicating an actual battle, but the phenomenon of that interior experience. And you can spell that out in one way in The Hobbit, and then the Lord of the Rings itself is, of course, admittedly, confessedly by himself, a much rather darker, much more complex, more mature, sophisticated story, and you can treat that same phenomenon again, but in a more protracted, more detailed, more nuanced way. And I think it's a very interesting thing to lay those two in parallel with one another.
Yeah, it is.
Or overlaying in one another.
I mean, he saw warfare himself, and he was aware that war occurred, and he studied warfare, and so he was not ignorant of that situation. I think he raises a question in here about the nature of warfare, and why do wars occur? Like, for instance, in this chapter, the opening of it seems odd to me. It's always seemed odd to me how the dwarves become antagonistic to the elves and men, so much so that they're ready to go to war. And then Dane shows up, and Dane is equally antagonistic to the men. And so you have these forces that should be allied that end up fighting one another. And the only reason that they don't actually commit, they don't actually have a point of contact in battle, is that they are saved by an external force that's even worse than they are, that's going to overwhelm them if they aren't careful. But it does raise the question, why, for us, for instance, as human beings, why do we go to war on a regular basis? It seems like we always do. And of course, this is something which right now is quite pertinent, especially over there in Europe. The idea of warfare and the idea of a big power, a big nameless power rolling through Europe suddenly. Why do we do that regularly as human beings? Kind of struck me when I was listening to that story going across the Dakotas. What is it in us as human beings that sees war and violence as the solution to everything? Doesn't that seem odd at all? It's not like the Beatles. It's not like that. It's make love, not war, and all that. That doesn't seem to be the right solution either.
That's not a good critique of it. It's certainly not a good alternative, to say nothing being vapid and meaningless. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing, because on the one hand, you can take, essentially what you said, Peter Kraft was talking about something, it may have even been related to Lord of the Rings. I mean, just one lecture, in maybe 20-something years ago, Peter Kraft was talking about this, and he brought up war. He's like, really, war's a funny thing. And he's saying, we have a disagreement, so we how do you say, we have an argument over something, so we agree that we shouldn't get dressed up in funny clothes and go out and kill each other in the morning. That'll be the way to solve it. And you put things sort of in that kind of way, you see that it's ridiculous. It's really odd. It's absurd in like the French philosophical sense of the term. It's absurd. But on the other hand, too, I think there's something to the idea that we're born into a world of struggle and strife. That is a situation of how we find ourselves. That's our situation in the world, right? The Sitz and Leben of the human race. And And in a realm of struggle and strife in this Middle Earth, there's a way in which we intuitively grasp that life is a battle. Life is, or love is a battlefield.
Yeah, right.
I think I'm getting
that. Peter Creve to Pat Benatar. That's a good.
Yeah. You know, at the same time, heaven is a place on earth, so let's not fool ourselves. But you know, in that way, I think we have. Bear with me as I sort of struggle through this. I think you could say something like we have a spiritual impulse towards battle and warfare because it's an acting out of, you know, we're trying to manifest physically, materially, that orientation or that experience of reality. And I think that's why we're not only prone towards war. Now, this doesn't justify war. There's lots of bad wars. Most wars are stupid or bad or evil. Many are evil. Most are stupid. Some are justified, understandable. Aspects of it can even be glorious in that way, in a strange way, usually in retrospect, never in the moment. And I think that is all possible precisely because there's something about the world we live in and our experience of it, that this is somehow a lodestone of sort. This is somehow a focal point. This is a way of sort of gathering that, like a magnetic point that gathers all that tension, that existential strife into a thing, into an event. And often I think it's misplaced, right? We direct that energy towards the wrong opponent.
So would it be,
and then that's the fundamental problem for.
You've said here that it's sort of like the situation we find ourselves in, the system lab, and is that would you say that the war is almost already inside of us? I mean, there's a conflict inside of us, certainly, between our better selves and our better.
Absolutely,
it's already there, you know.
Yeah.
And so when we, in some ways, war, physical war is a clarity because it allows us to focus on something that really needs attention. And, you know, like they say in the video game, point and click. You know, it's no longer what's going to happen. Who's going to win out? You know, now we know there's the enemy. Go get them. And so there's a sense of clarity about it.
Right.
But on the other hand, I mean, you could say, well, it has been said that life is itself a state of war, that it's always a state of war, of man against man, as Hobbes put it. It's what was that great movie, Poakatsi, right? Koyaanisqatsi, Poyakatsi, Nakwakatsi, and the life as warfare, life in a state of warfare. The concept being that we are already at war. You know, I was hearing this podcast just the other day with Jordan Peterson interviewing this guy who studies warfare and studies the situation of warfare, and he says that really amateurs study the spark points, the moments that create the actual warfare, but professionals study the situation and they look at what actually leads up to it. Yes. He said that there were three things that really created the environment of war, and they were, if I remember right, immigration, pandemic, and starvation. Those are the three major elements that contribute to the tension that creates warfare. I think to some degree he's right. That increases the level of actual conflict. But in his opinion, warfare really is already ongoing before the actual clash that occurs. It's warfare logical, it's warfare emotional, it's warfare sociological, all of that's going on. And I suppose one can make the argument, like in our current situation, we say, well, we run the risk of having war with this great big unnamed element. But before that, you can say, well, this war that's been going on for some time, it's been on the TV, on the movies, on the radio, it's been, it's been in our own hearts, it's been in our schools, it's been in our literature. It's like warfare has been going on for the last 40 or 50 years. The fact that we haven't had open warfare with a big unnamed opponent is simply almost an accident. It's almost like this. That's the exception.
Yeah, and in many ways, I mean, people have argued that in many ways the means, the other tools through which modern man exercises non, what's the right word, non-hot
Yeah, hot.
war, like not actually firing, non-gunpowder related weaponry. So information, propaganda, um, economics, financial, trade, media, all manner of things, is, makes us think there's
Yeah,
not a war, because we say, well, war should look like this. This is what war looks like. No, this is war. You're already in a war. And that's not counting the media cover-ups of people who are actually getting killed and shot and all these things and other stuff that's not, but like that aside, right? Just even on the face of it, you say, well, that's already war. And the people who are in the know, the analysts, talk about it. Yeah, the war has begun. It's just not a hot war. It's a media war. It's a financial war. These kind of things. But yeah, I think in many, somebody has argued. Some people have also argued that despite appearances, somebody like Steven Pinker, wrote a book, something like The Better Angels of Our Nature or something. He says, every day in every way, society is getting better and better. And see, look, the proof of that is that, over the last 100 or 200 years or whatever, his problem is, Pinker's problem is he uses way too small of a sample size historically. As I see, we fight less battles and less wars than historically they did before, so therefore, see, we're less violent. And it's been pointed out, very obvious holes in Pinker's argument, is that, but the sheer number of people massacred in any, 50-year period, or any really 10, 20-year period in the last 150, 200 years, vastly exceeds any given century prior to that. You instead of small little skirmishes on a regular basis between the Republic of Florence and the Duchy of Spoleto or something here, these small little city-states in Italy that are, every few months or every few years running out into the fields and chopping at each other and running home again, are far less violent in terms of the devastation, in terms of the loss of human life, than, a 6-month or even a 1-month conflict in modern period. Just the scale of destruction.
The scale of destruction and the ability to destroy human lives almost without any contact to that person or any glory or any kind of nobility in the act itself. You push a button and fire rains from the sky. That kind of sense that warfare and the scale and carnage has changed. That's a big factor to take into consideration. And this is kind of what I'm leading up to, of course. I'm leading up to looking at why does Tolkien in the end of this book want to put in a big old war, okay? When I'm listening to Lord of the Rings with Rob Inglis reading it, that whole conflict there in front of Minas Tirith, and then, of course, the conflict that occurs in front of the Black Gates, there's a real clarity to it. You're fighting really bad characters, goblins and trolls and wargs.
You're fighting monsters.
Yeah, fighting monsters.
There's no moral ambiguity.
No moral ambiguity.
Right? They're even.
No, when the Nazgul Lord comes down and descends upon Theoden, you're not like, I wonder if he's just having a bad day, or I wonder if he has a wife back home. No, this is something this is pure evil as a monster descending upon Theoden, and it needs to be killed. So Tolkien was not unaware of the things we just talked about, the state of constant warfare, the sense that man is made insignificant in modern warfare, the lack of nobility and the tawdriness of war. He wasn't unaware of those things.
Yeah.
And so, on the one hand, why does he put warfare in all of his novels, like Silmarillion, Hobbit, Lord of the Rings? It's not just because conflict makes for a good story. I think he's saying something about the very nature of warfare. And why does he, except for the Silmarillion, because of course the killing of elf by elf is, that's an big,
one of the greatest tragedies in the history of Middle Earth. It haunts this.
But otherwise, these great battles that happen against Sauron and against Morgoth and all, they are battles against monsters. There's no moral ambiguity at all. It kind of takes that out.
It's worth mentioning, though, that he does highlight at certain moments, so in lower intensity moments, overlooked, in moments that are often overlooked. He highlights the fact that there is still moral ambiguity in many of the individuals who find themselves a part of the war. So I think one of the most moving elements is when Samwise, when they see the Mumakil, and the Dunedain of the south ambush the enemy that's coming up to the reinforcements are coming to swell Sauron's ranks. There's a man who falls, he's shot in the back, falls face down. He's one of the enemy. He's part of the enemy army. But Sam sees him, and he said, there's this moment. I'm like, my God. I mean, he's just like me. I wonder what lies or threats or desperation drove him to come here. What was his family like? What's his family like? What was his home like back home? What draws a person to come into this? Which is, of course, something especially in the Great War in Middle Earth in our days, in World War One. Very much, the people that you're shooting at are just like you. They're not, like, there's no evil power that's trying to take over. This is somehow, we're just at the whims of the machine, the bigger machine that's already in motion.
Precisely, yeah. And even the use Easterlings and the people for the South Bronze, these were just human beings that had themselves been led to warfare against the West by Sauron.
Right. And what do you do with that? Because I think that's a key insight, though, that he shares with us into the nature of the fact that life is war. If life is warfare, or there's warfare that's pervasive across life, across our life in this world, we have that yet in tension with the fact that the other actors involved are no less innocent than you or I most of the time, and yet the war we must fight. How do you discriminate?
That's really interesting because, okay, let's step back for a minute on that question that you just asked. The moral ambiguity is much more intense in Lord of the Rings than it is in The Hobbit, because Hobbit is clear. You're fighting orcs. Okay,
there's orcs and there's everybody else, and we're here together. We're about to fight each other, but now we're not.
I mean, okay, bad guys. I guess we should do a quick chapter summary, right? There's a battle. It's Battle of Five Armies, right? It's elves, dwarves, men versus orcs and wargs. Eagles and Beorn come in later. Okay, and of course there's that horrible scene in Peter Jackson where Beorn does a halo jump from an eagle and lands as a bear in the midst of the orcs. It's so heinous. It's like you couldn't have made a more laughable scene. But anyway, that's that point. So you get five armies that are fighting one another. Okay. Here we don't have men or elves or dwarves that have been tempted to fight on the side of evil and darkness. You've got three good races that are about to fight one another. And if the orcs didn't show up, they would fight in a massive battle that would have been devastating to all of them and would have made lasting scars and would have been really tragic because they're supposed to be getting along. I mean, Bilbo even says, I think in the last chapter of The Thief in the Night, he says, my good elves, wouldn't you like to be at home instead of here waiting for battle? He's very aware of the idea that these folks should be getting along with one another and not fighting.
Right. So
if the orcs didn't show up and the wargs, you would have had a really awful situation. I wonder whether or not this is, though, pointing to something that Tolkien was already thinking about, which is modern warfare does not seem to be motivated by the same motivations of the past. Okay? In the past, at least in Tolkien's mind, in the past, warfare seems to have been over a noble idea, or over protection of what was seen as a good, or over conflicts between people based on property or goods. It seems as though now warfare, Tolkien seems to be suggesting, warfare is driven by a force that really is an inhuman force, almost demonic force. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't carnage in the past, because of course there was. And there were certainly atrocities, and there were certainly awful things that happened. That's not unknown. But if you take even what the Battle of Five Armies, I'm sure that this was based upon an actual event, and I'm pretty sure that the event that it was based upon was the Siege of Vienna. Okay, that's just what I gleaned from the clues in this story and the fighting on the ridges and the like, because the same thing seems in the Battle of Vienna. There are like 3 battles of Vienna. So this is the one in 1683. And in 16
with Jan Sobieski.
Jan Sobieski, the Pole, right? The king. Yeah. He was he the king of Poland? Is that what it was?
The breaking of the siege of Gondor in the Return of the King is explicitly about that. It was explicitly lifted from the breaking of the siege of Vienna by Jan Sobieski and his winged hussars. So the riders of Rohan, in that moment, in their positioning on the battlefield, and the positioning of Gondor vis-a-vis the mountains and everything, is very clearly meant to be Vienna, and Jan Sobieski's winged hussars riding down to break the siege. But I'd never heard like the idea of the Battle of the Five Armies, especially with what we were saying before, that really these two battles, or these two battles overlaid on one another. Really, 3 battles. There's the Pelennor Fields, the Gladden Fields outside the gates of Mordor, where the eagles actually come again, and Pippin finds himself under a troll. But the Battle of the Five Armies being the siege of Vienna as well. I hadn't thought about that before, but I see it because, of course, they're explicitly the eagles coming down.
Yes, the eagles coming down. The alliance of the various Western powers against an overwhelming force. The fighting on the field to save something that was noble. There's a lot there that
oh my goodness.
The parallels between Pelennor Fields and the Five Armies, I think, do exist. But I think both of them, coming back to that Battle of Vienna in 1683 with Jan Sobieski. And if that's the case, Tolkien, who was a minor historian, he didn't specialize in it, but he certainly knew history. I think he would have looked back on some of these battles and said, this was a moment where Western civilization was being saved from being ruined. We have to be aware to some degree of abilities. The thinking about the Muslim empire up until very recently by most people was that Islam was a serious threat to Europe, a very credible threat to Europe.
And to I just want to put the lens shift, so remove some of the baggage that we have today. Wars historically tend not to be fought over ideology. And up until the modern period, nobody really gave a damn about the theology of Mohammedans, of Muslims. The idea was there's an outside force, because the Christian nations, many and sundry, always changing their borders and frequently fighting one another, which is actually a big theme of the Battle of Vienna, or constitute one family. There's very clear boundary on the outside of that, even if the compartments within within European Christendom are fuzzy. There's a very clear boundary between those who are in the family, those who are part of this bigger tribe, and this other big tribe, which is many different peoples of varying theologies, generally, which is why they preferred to use the term, Saracen is a very common term, because it's more of a generic pan-ethnic thing rather than specifying their particular creedal commitments. It's about barbarians from outside the household breaking in through the walls. And so they're not, it's the forces that are a threat more than the theology of Islam, lest we get confused, because in the modern thinking, we tend to like to fight over ideas and ideologies, but historically they fight over real and known danger.
Absolutely. I mean, even the fall of Constantinople happens because the emperor refuses, well, one of the reasons is because the emperor refuses the canon that is offered to him by the Viennese. I mean, the Viennese offered him canon, and he said, I don't want to pay that price, it's too expensive. The Viennese went to the Muslim leader of the forces. He says, I have some cannon. And he said, okay, I'll buy it. And he used those cannons to pummel the walls of Constantinople to cause it to collapse in 1453 in the overrunning of the city. So it wasn't like, gee, I need to sell to Christians. It was, I need to sell to somebody.
Well, the Venetians will sell to the highest bidder.
Yeah, I sell to the highest bidder. You're right. It wasn't so much of a ideology. It wasn't even so much of a race thing. That didn't exist.
No.
It was a clear.
No, we hadn't invented race.
Yeah, it was a clear and present danger. And so this idea that Vienna, this great and noble city, was about to be overrun by what was perceived as a barbaric force, you know, a force that was antithetical to Western civilization, was far more important than that they were going to be overrun by people from the Middle East or the people from the Muslim religion or whatever it was.
There was no idea of Arabs or somehow these guys are going to make us all worship a different way. It was, you know.
But what I find really interesting is that here's Tolkien, who has suffered through a battle of ideology, because, you know, World War I, I think to a great degree, World War I was one of the first real ideological wars that occurred. I mean, I suppose you could say that to a certain degree the American Civil War was too. But really, it was an ideological war, and it was a war that was, in many ways, it seems unnecessary. I think that there's the great historian that did the Wars of the World was his series. He did the Rise of Wealth and a number of others. Teaches down in Texas. But anyway, he made the point that this war was really one of the first wars of ethnic tensions, and it was a war of ideological proportions rather than of, you know, nobility or clear and present danger or whatever. And that certainly World War II as well. This rise of the idea of the folk in Germany and the need to rule by the master race. I think Tolkien was already seeing that this was a shift in the way that warfare occurred in the human situation. And I would hazard that he's suggesting that it's driven by a force that's much darker than normal human passions, normal human consideration.
There's something. Yeah, I think he would wholeheartedly endorse the idea that there's something driving the war that's bigger than the will or the choices of any one of the human actors.
Right.
Or even all the human actors together.
Right.
Which is why it's so strange in something like World War I, which I encompass to mean a longer period than just the actual fighting, but, you know, about 2 decades preceding it and then leading up, including World War II and what follows. As really the Great War is a much longer term bigger thing. There's things that happen again and again that just don't make sense, right? People acting in a way that I don't want to say is irrational, but it's like they're it's like they're being concertedly, they're acting in concert to a certain end of mutual destruction, not by their mutual agreement, but there's another force, there's another will above them directing their actions in that way.
Yes. And I think that was
and I think that we see that a lot in the Silmarillion too.
And the Silmarillion, right. Driven by forces that are really not natural forces at all. That's why I think the key element to turning this battle in this chapter is Gandalf. It's a wonderful image because Gandalf, who is he's kind of the Virgil. He's like Virgil to Dante in some ways. He's the guiding force of reason, but he's also the guiding force of wisdom more than anything else. He's the one that appears suddenly on the field of battle. And he's the one that calls the leaders together and says, look, we got a bigger problem. And this bigger problem is not to consume all of you. And imagine if you could turn the attention of the common soldier in World War I away from killing the other guy in the trench to suddenly think, what's the bigger problem? What's driving us to slaughter each other like cattle? Do we have anything in common? I mean, it happened right in that event of the Christmas truce, right? In 1914, I think it was, early in the war. Germans and English suddenly realized, hey, you know, we're just humans. We have the same desires and loves and feelings. They got together and they had a Christmas party, basically, and they stopped the war. And had that gone on, the war would have ceased. But, of course, the High Command said, no, you can't do this anymore. And they arrested all the people, basically, and shipped them off to various parts of the universe.
Put you in different parts. Because they won't fight each other.
And suddenly the war was back on again because you can't, you know, what if you had a war and nobody came, right? So the voice of reason in this chapter, Gandalf, shows up on the field and turns their attention to this darker force that's about to descend on them. And it's a great example because Gandalf, of course, has roots in the character of Odin, you know, in Norse mythology. And there's an image, I mean, Odin, there's a lot of stories attached to Odin, which I find really remarkable. There's one where he's tied to a tree. I think it's an ash tree. And he's tied to a tree and he sees the rune letters on the ground in his suffering. So his suffering brings about this great wisdom of learning the rune letters, and then he passes those on to human beings. And that's where we learn writing. rune writing. It's from Odin's suffering on the tree. But there's another story about Odin where he's Odin the Wanderer, and he wanders about among human beings, dressed in a gray cape, a pointed hat with a brim, and a scarf of silver. And he has a staff, and he goes, long white beard, and he goes about to human beings to experience what human beings go through, and to give wisdom to men, and to do a little bit of legwork about when Ragnarok is going to occur. And that's, to me, that's really, is that a Gandalf image? Yes, I think it is.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the Great Pilgrim.
Yeah, the Great Pilgrim, exactly. That's even taken directly from the Odin the Wanderer thing. Just looking at what I put in my notes here, the very word Gandr, is the exact sense of this word is somewhat dubious. It says it's mostly used in poetry and in compounds and denotes anything enchanted or an object used by sorcerers, almost like Zauber in German, and hence a monster or fiend, and thus the Leviathan of Northern mythology is called Jormungandr, the great or grand. And he's the snake of the earth. So Gandr is like great or powerful or amazing. Now, he takes the name Gandalf from that list of dwarves, but I'm sure that he's got in mind this word, Gandr, which means powerful or fearful or, sorceress-like. He is a character who is, I think, connected to that otherworldly thing, which allows him then to see what happens in the dark realms that are pushing men around, pushing humans, or dwarves and elves and men in this case. And so he's the one that directs them to that power that's descending on them from the north. Right? Great. That's a great image, because what if we all had that? What if we all had a Virgil that could tell us, hey, this is the path you got to take? It'd be so much more clear. And, maybe we do have that.
Yeah.
Maybe we do have that.
Yeah.
Maybe we just don't listen.
It's very interesting that you point out. I think that's right. Because Gandalf has, when you really look at it and you reread everything there, you see Gandalf he's somehow got a clear insight into the workings of the gods, into the bigger forces at work. He knows. It doesn't seem to be all the wizards. He specifically has this sort of clear sight. It's like he can see, it's almost as though he's metaphorically, he could see the various lines or wires or pathways kind of running through the air. Like he can see the Matrix kind of thing, to bring it to, metaphors of the modern imagination. The Matrix Kids was a movie that came out in the early 2000s, before you were born, but that new hip modern stuff. But what was the 90s? I don't even know. It's all a blur, man. But, it's like he can see then the workings of things. He's got a privileged insight into that. And perhaps we have somebody who can see that, or perhaps we have the capacity to see that if we just remove the film from our eyes.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I tend to think that he's getting at here, is I think he's getting at because of course the whole story is a psychological, it's a mythological imagery, symbolism abounds. I think one of the things he's getting at is that this image of battle at the end of the story represents something which is our own struggle on this earth, and frequently on this earth, our struggle is unclear. It's ambiguous. What are we fighting against? To use another reference, the 90s, I would only hit. I'd hit out if I could only know where to hit, as U2 says. But sometimes you don't know where to hit. You don't know where the enemy is. You don't know what's coming at you, and it's foggy. It's that fog of war thing. And if we were able to listen to the voice of conscience, or the voice of the Holy Spirit, if we want to call it that, we might more clearly see Chinese people are Chinese people. They're just people. The government itself is what is to be feared. That's the thing that we need to be feared. Russians are just human beings. They're just trying to live their lives. The normal Russian is just trying to live his life or her life. The government is driving them. And they drive them by certain specific means that gin up warfare and hatred of race and hatred of culture, rather than legitimate reasons for this. Again, that podcast, stunning podcast, by the way, I'll have to find it for you. The doctor was saying he visited China, and he visited this museum of the rape of Nanking. And Nanking is a bad moment in history, no doubt about it. I mean, that was a savage, awful business. But they've got a whole museum dedicated to showing how horrendous the Japanese were and putting the Chinese in the best of lights. And why would they do this? He says that he's seen numerous things like this throughout China when he traveled there just a year ago, where they've got different pieces of propaganda to gin up the Chinese people against the Japanese, to make them hate. Because as long as you see the enemy as unhuman, as monstrous, as needing to be wiped off the face of the earth, then you are capable of doing that action, which is open warfare, right? If you see them as human, if you see them as weak, or see them as in need of salvation, then it's very difficult to do that job. I think with Tolkien, he's making a clarity here that says, look, humans, elves, dwarves, they're not the enemy. There's something more beyond that. And that's the thing that really needs to be fought.
It's the dark flood of the goblins that are about to come over the mountain.
Yes.
That are driving us. In many ways, too, the Battle of Five Armies, to go right, sort of back to the text again, it's almost as though you could say the revelation, the revealing of the goblins and wargs pouring over the mountainside is the materialization of something that spiritually has been happening amidst the dwarves, the elves, and the men. Right? They're being driven towards war with one another. There's this goblin spirit, as it were, hardening Thorin's heart. I mean, that's the dragon spirit, dragon sickness. And then the elves and men and the Durin's folk, or Dain's folk rather, are coming in, and there's this goblinness amongst them getting ready to fight one another. And then the goblins materially come down, which allows them to with Gandalf being the catalyst, to exteriorize that against, there it is. Now we can take that and put that on them, and we can fight the real demons, because they're no longer internalized.
And so the clarity that Tolkien offers, which I really love. I mean, some people have said that he's too simplistic because he has people fighting monsters. I don't think that's the case at all. I think his complexity, the beauty of his work, is that he makes clear that there is an enemy. And the enemy is something manifest in human hearts, but really it comes from another source. It comes from this dark force. Call it Sauron or Morgoth or Glaurung or in this Smaug. It comes from a source that is beyond human comprehension. And to be aware of that is extremely important.
That's just it. It's not merely there's an evilness in our nature, there's two wolves inside of you or something silly like this, but that there is evil inside of you, but its provenance is from a third party. There is an other will at work, or there are other wills at work. There are malevolent forces in the cosmos that, yes, we have sin and darkness, but it's not something, at least not only inherent in human nature, but there are other puppeteers that would drive us to wicked actions. And we need to turn against them in order to expunge the darkness.
That's a very good point. Other forces at work, they all seem to be ginning up the wolfish side of human nature against the other side of human nature. I wonder if, we don't see that in spades in the character of Thorin. I skipped over this to get to the actual battle scene, but to go back in the text for a minute, there is at the opening of this chapter, this passage about the Arkenstone. And the elves and men show up at the door of Thorin again there at the mountain. And they say, is there nothing that you would trade some portion of gold for? What about this? And they show him the Arkenstone. Gandalf is there. The old man is there. And Thorin is, he's out of character, first off, because this has not been Thorin up to this point. He shows a side of himself that's really hideous. It's obviously motivated by the dragon wealth, focused on the Arkenstone. But you can indulge me for just a minute. I want to read this little passage of his seeing the stone. It's really amazing to me. This is right at the beginning of the chapter. And it says, no one spoke for a long while, because they see the Arkenstone. They're all dazed by this. Thorin at length broke the silence, and his voice was thick with wrath. "That stone was my father's and is mine," he said. "Why should I purchase my own?" The wonder overcame him, and he added, "But how came you by the heirloom of my house if there is need to ask such a question of thieves?" "We are not thieves," Bard answered. "Your own we will give back in return for our own." "How came you by it?" shouted Thorin in gathering rage. "I gave it to them," squeaked Bilbo, who was peering over the wall by now in a dreadful fright, which is kind of cool because, Bilbo, in the midst of this, he stands up to Thorin's rage. He says, "I'll take the blame for it. I did it," It's pretty darn courageous of the little dude. And then Thorin turns his dragon wrath on Bilbo. "You," cried Thorin, "you," turning upon him and grasping him with both hands. "You miserable hobbit, you undersized burglar," he shouted at a loss for words, and he shook poor Bilbo like a rabbit. "By the beard of Durin, I wish I had Gandalf here. Curse him for his choice of you. May his beard wither. As for you, I will throw you to the rocks," he cried, and he lifted Bilbo in his arms. So he's ready to kill Bilbo at that point. This guy who has gotten him out of jail and saved him from spiders and saved him from the dragon, and he's ready to murder this guy. That's kind of
defense.
Yeah. And Thompson, as Gandalf steps in and says, hey, put my thief down.
At least don't damage him if you're done with him. I'll take him back.
The passage is remarkable to me because Thorin is he's insane with this desire for the Arkenstone. For, as we said, I think the Silmaril that is.
Yeah.
He even turns against Gandalf too, right? And is angry at Gandalf and goes up against him and insults him. So here you've got a dwarf, right, who is consumed by a lust for the gold, but there's something else going on, because not just lust for gold, it's like a dragonish lust for gold. It's driven by a dark power.
It's this wrath that's underneath it, yeah, because if it were just gold, if it were normal, let's just say ordinary dwarfishness, you'd be fixated on the gold, you'd be calculating a way to increase your profits out of the situation. Yes. Because that's how they've behaved thus far, really. And it's a general trend. That's even that's what Smaug had to say about them, right? Essentially, and but the narrator himself tells us dwarves are not heroes. They place a great value, great importance on the value of money, but they're not bad folk if you don't expect too much, right? But here we've got something very different. He becomes this beast, and he's ready to throw. So he shakes Bilbo like a rabbit. So there's that rabbit. There's that rabbit parody again with parity with Bilbo being like a rabbit. But then what does that make Thorin? Yeah, he's like a dog, like a feral dog or a wolf shaking his newly caught rabbit.
Animalistic.
And making him in rage. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, even worse than an animal. I remember there's a passage out of Dante where Virgil says to Dante something to the effect that these people in hell are worse than animals, because animals don't necessarily have vision to be animal-like. When a human becomes animal-like, he has given away his reason, his compassion, and therefore is worse, has fallen further. And I think you're right. Thorin here he's like a rabid dog that will kill those around him. Even his own dwarves he would kill in this rage that he has. But it is, I think, highly symbolic of, first off, the loss of reason when any of us grow angry, and anger contributes to violence and therefore to war. Because when Dane appears, Thorin says, well, I have the ability not just to get back the Arkenstone, I have the ability to get back the Arkenstone and not have to pay the ransom. I can keep all the gold.
Which is their own money anyway. Yeah. So now I can steal, get away with it, and clear off my front door.
He becomes a worse thief than he accuses Bilbo of being. So he's fallen further than an animalistic level. He's fallen into a sort of treacherous, Gollum-like, you could say, level of monstrousness. And
it's this really deep diabolical.
Yeah, very, very diabolical. Yeah. And Dane him.
And that could be any. You go ahead with the Dane.
I was going to say, Dane just shows up and he's like, my people need help, and you're not going to stop me. So Dane just jumps into it. He doesn't have the diabolical thing, but he's drawn into it. And so Tolkien's like, this is how conflicts actually emerge, is that people get drawn in, you get goodwill, they get drawn into this by a basically demonic force.
Yeah. Yeah, as you say, there's that magnet, right? It's like a black hole. It begins to suck things into itself until we all smush together and end up in formless mass.
And there's a sense, like you brought this up, and I remember reading this in, Ambrose Bierce writes about the Americans this way, and of course the World War I was this way. There's this sense that you are helpless in the face of the crisis, that you are somehow, you're drawn into it, you can't stand up to it. It's going to happen, and it's going to be horrible, and you can't stop it, right? And of course, if Gandalf doesn't show up, that's exactly the point. That it's inevitable. Men and elves and dwarves are all going to fight each other, and it's going to be horrendous. And
that was going to be. I mean, that's the end of it. Then game over, right? I mean, they all slay each other.
Yeah.
And
the World War I is fought.
Nothing of them. Bilbo's got the ring, and then the goblins get it. Sauron reclaims it. Boom. End of Middle Earth. World over. Insert coin to continue. I mean, that's just it. When you know the bigger picture,
it's like the fear that
cataclysm
had in the 60s and the 70s during the Cold War. And Einstein, I think, said that he didn't know what World War III would be fought with. It probably fought with nuclear weapons, but he knew World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. The meaning being that the next big war is going to be so devastating, we'd be booted back to a Stone Age. And yeah, I think that's a fear that a lot of have. And Tolkien, again, in this marvelous clarity of the 20th century writer, he says, look, there's a bigger battle, and you have to have a clarity about what is really at stake. Because what's really at stake is not just that men and elves and dwarves are going to fight, is that they're going to fight and get overwhelmed by an even bigger force, a more evil force, sinister force.
So that brings a whole new level to how we understand the question of what is the battle that you're fighting.
Yeah.
What is the warfare that you're fighting? And that's an important thing to get clear, to make clear, to obtain clarity on again and again, especially when the external conflict intensifies and grows. To always call before our minds then too, what is the battle that I'm fighting?
Yeah.
Not just so I know so I can fight better, but it might not be the battle that you think. And I think that's the key takeaway.
Yes.
What's the battle I ought to be fighting?
Yes. And
should it be against Dane's folk, or should I be, or the goblins? Right.
Because the goblins are pretty awful. They're obviously Dane's folk. You can at least imagine them sitting around with a pint of beer and laughing and enjoying things. Goblins, not so much. And so that clarity is, look, here's the bigger enemy. This is what you should be fighting. But again, that's like being able to transcend seeing the enemy as monstrous and seeing that you and the enemy are both humans involved in a conflict with a greater force.
Exactly. And seeing that the monster is the real enemy. My human enemy is not actually a monster. To demonster them, rehumanize the external human opponent, and turn that wrath, turn that energy towards the monster, the goblin. And then the question is, what is that? What is a monster and all of that?
Yeah, it's interesting how Tolkien frequently has these images of beautiful things being corrupted by evil. Like Moria, which was a dwarf stronghold, gets corrupted, or like Minas Ithil, which becomes Minas Morgul. And these images of beautiful, bright things that obviously have been taken over and corrupted, which then which creates the obvious extraction that the beautiful things that we see in the story have the potential of being conquered and corrupted. There is a possibility that these dark forces could win out. There's never a guarantee that Minas Tirith is going to stand, or there's never a guarantee that the dwarves and the men and the elves are not going to fight each other. It's not like a given thing. One of the things taken into account here is this history that goes back before the story of the Hobbit. And we see some of this in the appendix of the Lord of the Rings. There was a fortress in the north called Gundabad, and Gundabad was a dwarvish force originally, I think, with Durin. And Durin gets overrun by, he's one of the first of the dwarves, and he establishes this fort of dwarf stronghold in the north, and it gets overrun and conquered by orcs, and that becomes a major stronghold for orcs, and the dwarves try to take it back a couple times. There's even a fight which Thorin himself is involved in. I think his father, no, his father was also involved in it, yeah. Then Thorin actually loses his shield during that fight, and he picks up a trunk and uses it as a shield, and that's why it's called Thorin Oakenshield, you know. But in this fight to try and get back Gundabad, they kill the king of the orcs, and his son is actually the leader of this army that's attacking the dwarves here. It's not the, like, I always thought that it was the son of the great goblin in the Misty Mountains, but it ain't. It's actually the son of, is it Bolg, I think?
That sounds right.
And he is
Bolg and the goblin.
Yes, he was the one that was killed in the battle. Oh no, it's Azog. Azog was the guy that was killed, the supreme commander of Gundabad. And this is seriously geek stuff, so pardon me for this. Azog is the king of the orcs. It's killed by Thorin and Thorin's father. And so Azog has been, his son, Bolg, has been planning this attack for quite some time and gathering orcs to the north. And so when they descend on the dwarves, having heard of Smaug's death, they're descending on them both for gathering the gold, but mostly it's for revenge. It's for a pure carnal, like, you kill my father, we're going to kill you. Prepare to die. Yeah, exactly. Nico Montoya. So there's, again, this long-standing hatred and revenge cycle that seems to be playing out here. And it's not going to end well for the three armies of men and elves and dwarves, because they're overwhelmed by these orcs. So again, I like to think about this as like, this is Tolkien's observation about the nature of warfare. Warfare frequently occurs because we have these savage impulses in us to revenge and destruction that are driven by a dark force. Because even behind Bolg's attack is the force of the necromancer. As you find out in the, in this right here, I have it right here. You find out in this right here, the appendix to the Return of the King, the son of Azog has been driven by Sauron to seek revenge. And so he's descending on the dwarves because Sauron has orchestrated this thing and basically moved the orcs around, encouraging them to do this. So it's interesting that even behind the orcs themselves, there's a dark driving force that drives them out of their mountains to seek revenge. Kind of fascinating to me. And, the thing that saves them is the eagles, right?
It's the eagles, the special birds of the gods.
The birds
are particularly dear to, it's not Manwë.
Yep, that's right. Manwë's eagles. Yeah.
And so there's something I wanted to highlight here that seems to be clear to me. I want to draw it out. Is we're talking about the sense of warfare is pervasive in human life, and that the proper way to look at it is as is it Solzhenitsyn or Dostoevsky? If it was one, it was the other. They both, in a sense, to say the same thing. Talked about the line between good and evil doesn't lie out here. It cuts right through the heart of every man, right? Comes right through the heart of myself, cuts right through myself. It's a line between good and evil. So somewhere that's where the battleground is, really, the deeper, more real battleground. And so that any one of us could become Thorin in that rabid dog kind of state, if put in the right conditions. And lest we think that this sort of came out of nowhere, we look back a chapter or two and we see they're singing these songs. That is to say, they're weaving these spells, right? The dwarf song, as it's the most recent version of the dwarf song in the final release before the battle, is about, we've slain the dragon and ever so our foes shall fall. And we've got these enemies camping out at the gate. We're ready to do anything. We're ready to think about, they're no longer the men of Lake Town. They're no longer elves. There's no longer even the Hobbit who saved our butts a number of times. but these are just the nameless enemy, and we will slaughter
That's
them.
a beautiful point. I got to say, it's a beautiful point. I really like that very much. I was thinking the other day, I just did a setting to Erendil was a mariner. And at the same time I was working on that, my son and I did a version of the orc song when they dragged the hobbits down to, and the dwarves down into Goblin Town.
Yeah.
But the thing that I was noticing was that there's such a distinction in Tolkien songs between the songs delivered by different races. And it's not always this way, but most all the Elvish songs are about longing and about loss and beauty. Longing, loss, beauty, that kind of thing. Most of the songs of the men are about everyday experiences, you know, about work and about play and about hopes for the future. Most of the songs of the dwarves, most of the songs of the hobbits, they're like fun songs and laughing songs and eating songs and traveling songs and that kind of thing.
Yeah, they've entitled them that way: a walking song, a drinking song, a sleeping song, a bathing song.
But almost all of the dwarvish songs are about destruction and past hurts. Destruction.
Yeah.
There are almost no dwarvish songs about creation of beauty or hope for the future or glory of the race or anything like that. It's all, you know, they've done us wrong. We're going to get revenge. Or we're going to
get chip on your shoulder.
Yeah, it's interesting. The songs, as you said, the spells that they weave, they create the culture of the group. And the culture of the group with the dwarves is one about redress of past grievances and destruction of things current. That's really interesting to me.
That's fascinating. And yeah, that's exactly it. And so they've been steeping, they've been bathing themselves in this mentality, and it gets even more vengeful. And so they've been holed up in there in the Lonely Mountain. I like what you said. That's a key phrase. The way you said that, it was something that these songs that they sing, the spells that we've shaped the mentality of the group or something like that. If I ever do another dissertation, God willing, it'll be on the shaping of self-concept through these narrative stories in different peoples. I think that'd be fascinating to examine.
I mean, the adage is that whatever the mind focuses on expands, right?
Yeah.
And to be realistic about it, there is nobody that hasn't suffered during their life. You know, there's no household that hasn't. Everybody has suffered. Some of us more than others, certainly. And some of us more intensely than others. But nobody is without suffering. But if all of our songs are about suffering and weeping and sorrow and demise, well, we begin to think that's all there is. If all of our songs are about how great our group is and how much that other group sucks, we begin to believe that's absolutely the case. And the spells, the songs, if you want to extend it to the imagery that we surround ourselves with on a regular basis galvanizes our mind, our soul, our spirit, our nous to action. This is why, I mean, this is something which, you know, for all the things that we can say against them, the Nazis were really good with propaganda. You know, they had that, baby. They had that down. They look snappy in their Hugo Boss outfits, you know. And really understand, Goebbels and the others understood that you take images, songs, rallies, mythology, if you will, and you can turn an entire people's imagination towards focusing it towards nothing but warfare, right? And they make them strong. They thought they make them stronger that way. I think it makes it weaker, but they thought it makes them stronger. And certainly the ravages that the Nazis inflicted on the rest of Europe bear witness to that fact, that ordinary Germans, you know, Klaus the butcher, right? Hans the cattle herd, were turned into violent and dangerous people because they bought into this propaganda, or because they were coerced by everybody else that was buying into the propaganda, you know.
Because the way that kind of crowd psychology works, if you really want something to keep you up at night, read you know, in a freakish way, because it's not it's not a horror story, but something to keep you up at night if you think about it. When you think about it, is oh gosh, what's his name? Gustave Le Bon or Gustave Le Bon? one of the two. There's either an R or there's not an R. I don't remember.
Okay.
And his work on crowd psychology or mass psychology, depending on how it's translated in a particular edition, but really delves into this phenomenon of the way that propaganda and essentially groupthink, and really simplifying the terms here, can become pervasive in a mass crowd to drive people to do things that not only would any one individual among them never think of doing, but is not even aware that they're participating in that moment. That there's really a spirit of the group, which is much bigger and often much darker at the whims of whatever programming was imbued on them. And what human beings are capable of under that kind of influence, it's a massive.
It's abominable. I mean, but it could go the other way too, which is, I don't know whether LeBlanc covers this or not. It can go the other way. Yeah. Because we could also have imagery of beauty and light and happiness and joy and sharing, and those images reinforced with ritual on a daily or weekly basis can encourage us to greatness and to happiness and to communal living. That's the whole premise behind most of the major religions, especially Christian. The premise is that this is the way you should live, not in savage blood.
Right. No.
Huh. Yeah. I'm just kind of struck by that suddenly, because I'm thinking about our current era. Not only its antipathy towards Christianity, but its antipathy towards great stories, too. And
if you become the songs you sing or the stories you sing, then I want you to flesh out that extra.
Well,
like what then? What do
we make of this? Yeah. I mean, one of the things we make of it is we have a phenomenon right now. We have several phenomena. We have a phenomenon of fan enjoyment of, I don't know what else to call it, trivial pop culture. Okay. I don't know what else to call it. And I don't like to use that term because it seems pejorative. But things like Trekkies, Star Wars fans, Avengers fans, Marvel Comics, DC Comics fans, Tolkien fans, people that have taken this love of these great stories to different degrees to such an extreme that they will dress up like the characters and go to a ritual where they associate with other people that have dressed up as these characters. They'll sing the songs. They'll translate Shakespeare into the original Klingon, that kind of thing. I found numerous sites in my research of people that have taught themselves Elvish based on Tolkien's works. Now, what does one make of all this? This here, I think, is an example of human beings searching, longing for meaning and clarity in their lives. And the images that they love, that they fall in love with, and then they reinforce, they seem to be giving greater clarity to their lives. I know what I am. I am a Trekkie, I am a Klingon from the planet Rigel, whatever it is. I'm not a Trekkie, so I don't know what I'm talking about. But that's why I think fans are so rabid when it comes to anybody tinkering with their stories, messing their stories up, adulterating stories. That's why they get so angry. It's because they're really what's really going on is that you're taking great ritual and great imagery and great reinforcing of certain messages, and you're making the complete opposite. You're making it into something that it is not, and it makes people really, really mad. And why have people latched on to all these things right now? I honestly think that I take Nietzsche's point very seriously, where he says that God is dead. God is dead. Okay? I don't think that doesn't mean that God, the actual God, is dead. It means, in Nietzsche's terms, our modern culture has divested Christianity of its impact, of its power, of its seriousness, made it into something trivial, and you see church, just in my own Catholic faith, our own Catholic faith, you see churches where people are boogieing down on the altar, where a guy is blowing bubbles during the communion section. You see people singing stupid songs or wiggling their rear end for Jesus or slapping each other on the butt for Christ, and it's like, this is not Christianity. This is not what it should be. And you have made it so trivial that I'm going to go and follow the Avengers, right? Because it's a profound story that I'm being told and that I'm engaging in than what I'm seeing weekly in the church, right? Now, I'm sorry if that was a soapbox, but I really think that's what, I mean, Tolkien himself railed against this modernity in the church. And he said over and over again, it's going to be the ruin of the church.
Right. And this is critique of Disney too, over really good, over real fairy stories, is that instead of the defense of Disney saying, these are things that, hey, look, he's exposing people to these traditional stories. He said, no, he's gutting them, he's eviscerating them and making them distasteful, giving he's poisoning the treasure house of their symbolic imagination.
And in doing so, this is interesting to me. In doing so,
I'm just gonna shut the window here. Keep going.
that's okay. In doing so, the people that engage in that divesting of the thing, divesting it of its impact, the people that are doing so are either creating the conditions of war or are themselves engaged in war. You know, remember that this guy this professor was saying, war is normally heightened, or the potential for war is created by immigration, starvation, and pandemic. And if you take that in a metaphorical sense, in terms of our imagery, right, our divesting of imagery, you know, a disease or a pandemic is that a message that is contrary to the original message has gotten into the imagery, and all of a sudden you've got Superman being gay, or whatever it is, right? You've got starvation, which is that suddenly the stories have no meaning. They have no meat to them anymore. They're meaningless. And you've got immigration, right? You've got people wandering from one place to the other looking for a home, and they're homeless. They don't have a rootedness anymore. They're not part of that community, either the Christian community or the Star Trek community or whatever community is. Their community has been destroyed, and they've been displaced like so many people were displaced after World War II. I think metaphorically, we've been looking at this kind of psychological warfare for the last 50 or so years. That's kind of stunning.
Yeah.
That's stunning. And so so then the big question is, who is the real enemy? You know, I don't mean to be like, you remember Sinead O'Connor years back when she tore the picture of the Pope up? Or who the real enemy is. Well, I know what you're doing, Sinead, but he wasn't the real enemy, right? Our real enemy is somebody who is he's not a somebody, I guess you could say.
Not so easily
done away with. Yeah. Wow. So eagles finally save us at the end, and they lift they get rid of the orcs. Beorn comes in there, that protean force, and so it's almost like this chthonic thing at the end. And the struggle ends with just the eagles are coming, and he blacks out, and then we don't know anymore until he wakes up. We find out what happens next time. But I'm of half a mind to say we've covered good ground here.
Yeah.
And ready to quit and move on, and next week pick up where we left off. Don't you think?
I think that sounds good.
Cameron, thank
you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rob.
And I look forward to talking to you in the near future. All right.
Likewise. We'll see you soon.
Wherever you fare, to your Aries, receive you at the journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you to where the sun sails and the moon walks.
So long.